I call Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is a pleasure, Mr Speaker, to take a call on this, the third reading of the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board. I have been able to follow this bill right through the whole process as a member of the Government Administration Committee. And of course I would like to recognise and acknowledge the Chair, the Honourable Ruth Dyson, and my colleagues that sit on the committee with me. I'd like to acknowledge Sarah Dowie. She was the Deputy Chair at the time, but she's moved on to another committee, but she's been replaced by the very able Mr Paul Foster-Bell, who comes onto the committee as the new Deputy Chair. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Brett Hudson, who also sits on the committee with me, Mojo Mathers from the Green Party, and Adrian Ruai, who made a very good speech and took a very good call earlier, and of course my good friend and parliamentary rugby team teammate Chris Farfoy. No, I think I got everyone, Phil. This is I know that in the committee stages, Mr Speaker, you gave me a fair bit of latitude in terms of talking about some of the churches that are affected by this, and I think that's actually really important, and I think that I will come back to that. But one thing that I would like to do also is to acknowledge the Honourable Dr Nick Smith, who was the original sponsor of this bill, and of course going through the list, I'd like to acknowledge some of the churches that are in his electorate. There's the Ansbrook Church of Nelson. There's the Unite Church in Nelson, which actually, the Unite Church I know is heavily involved in youth missions and youth counselling, and so I want to acknowledge them and the work that they do in the community in Nelson. I know that there's another one. I've covered the Richmond Church of Christ. In Nelson, the Richmond Church of Christ. I do want to acknowledge them as 3 of the members and a member of 30, because obviously there was their local member, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith, that originally sponsored the bill and brought the bill to the House, which is an important one. I'd just like to maybe go over a little bit of the history again, Mr Speaker. So, the Christian Churches New Zealand was the name given to an association of more than 30 congregations throughout New Zealand. Until 2012, they generally described themselves locally as Churches of Christ. Together, they are still known legally as the Associated Churches of Christ in New Zealand, which of course, as part of this bill, there is going to be a name change. Christian Churches New Zealand congregations are autonomous, but they act together through their regular national conferences. And I think this is very important. If you actually were to make contact with any of the churches, or if you're living in a certain area, for example Nelson, and you happen to be moving to Invercargill or Tasman or Auckland or Tauranga, they already have a very strong network. So you're able to enjoy what would hopefully be a seamless transition from one congregation and one church to another. One of these churches that are very aligned in what they're doing. I have to say that as a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, I got a little bit of ribbing about, that's right, about taking calls on this, but you know what, at the end of the day, actually we're all bound together by a Christian faith, and that's what's important. I don't know why, to be honest with you, I find it actually very rude that there's interjections on a bill like this coming from the whip on the opposition party. This is no, I'm not exaggerating. This is something that actually is pretty important to people, and two of your members have got up and made very good contributions, and you're sitting there making fun of it, and that shows a lot that actually indicates a lot about the way that you guys think. It's poor. It's very poor, and I can guarantee you right now. No, I'm serious. That there's people sitting at home watching people actually stand up and speak to this. Something that is fundamentally very important, because you know what? The way that they use their assets, the way that they administer, the way that they deal in their communities. This is fundamentally very important to them. So I would ask that you keep your comments to yourself and you have respect for the House and allow everyone to get up and make their contributions. Thank you very much. The global family of Christian churches and the Churches of Christ now extend to more than 185 countries. It was begun in the early 1800s in both the United Kingdom and the United States of America. It evolved largely from a concern growing strongly through the Enlightenment era that the church had become rigid, authoritarian and divided, making the meaningful preaching of the Christian message more challenging for them, of course. Christian and churches pioneers felt strongly that the whole church would be more effective if it showed unity, and I believe that was a very important step, and I believe that actually unity, wherever you find it, always provides a very powerful message. The whole church would be more effective, and that they would return to and use the New Testament for their model. They intended that their message should be one of reform within the church, but eventually they were forced to become a separate movement in themselves. And I think that just talking about the history of these churches is that if you go back and look at, for example, and we heard a very good contribution from Chester Burrows, who's very strong in his Christian faith. And so I want to acknowledge and talk about one of the churches actually in his electorate. It's the Riverside Christian Church. That church had their first meeting. It was founded back in April 28th, 1867. And I think actually why this is quite a good example is because at that time they had no assets at all. They rented a hall and they had their first meeting there. But now as time progressed, they started to accumulate assets, and of course it was important for them to know exactly how they could use those assets and the best way to be able to administer in the community that they were working in. And that's why this bill is so important, because we're allowing them and we're giving them the flexibility, as Chester Burrows alluded to, is that some of these ministries don't want to have all their capital tied up in assets. They want to be able to free some of that up to be able to actually perform the missions that they do. I think this church has actually got some members that are leaving fairly soon for Papua New Guinea on a mission there. And so if they're able to free up some funds to be able to support those types of missions, these are very important things to them. The Churches of Christ was established in New Zealand soon after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, again going back to these very early dates. And the first congregation was actually in Nelson, which I think probably gives it some real added value and meaning to Dr. Nick Smith. In 1944, other cities were added. Auckland in 1845, Dunedin in 1858, Christchurch in 1870. By 1885, they actually had 25 churches that had joined as part of the group. The First Dominion Conference was held in 1901 in the capital city here in Wellington. National conferences became annual gatherings by 1920. They provided opportunities for stimulus and inspiration and enabled the churches to work together in home mission projects, ministerial training, Christian education, women's work, examining public issues, and they also were able to produce a national paper. Along with other mainstream churches, Churches of Christ experienced a drop in numbers, and of course over the years, there would be an ebb and flow. Numbers would decrease and then increase again, which is very common with a lot of different organisations. And this led to a simplification of structures and a focus on development. New churches have been established, and the movement as a whole is growing, which is a very positive thing, Mr. Speaker. Initially, property was in the name of the elders of the congregations, which was common because obviously in the very early years they were starting to slowly accumulate assets, and often it was obviously these churches were driven by a small group of people, so it wasn't uncommon for them to be registered in the name of these original elders and leaders within the churches. On April 18, 1924 in Dunedin, at a duly convened conference of delegates from the churches, a board of trustees of certain members of the churches was set up. So that was the original board of trustees.
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Councillor Sepuloni.
Mr. Speaker,